Welcome to In Focus with Ijaz Haider. If last Thursday's meeting between top diplomats of the United States and China is anything to go by, Sino-US relations are off to an even rockier start than during former President Donald Trump's tenure. As cameras rolled at Anchorage in Alaska, and U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken made his initial comments before the media, China's top diplomat Yang Jiechi took the floor and launched a broadside at the U.S. policies, referring to the U.S. as a bully, racist, and hypocritical. This begot Blinken to respond, and from there on, it was a slanging match that went on for over an hour. As most observers know, comments before the media are kept brief and generally courteous before real talks begin. That format was upended during the first official meeting. Interestingly, comments from both sides after the two-day talks ended without a breakthrough, I might say, suggest that closed-door talks might have been more substantive, even if acrimonious. There are a number of issues on the table for our discussion tonight. I'm joined by Dr. Larus, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the University of Mary, Washington. Einar Tangen, a political and economic affairs commentator, joins me from Beijing. And Andrew K.P. Leung, chairman of Andrew Leung International Consultants, who joins me from Hong Kong. So let's see how this begins. Now, according to the Financial Times report, the Chinese officials had come to Alaska hoping for a reset in relations after 4 turbulent years under Donald Trump. But apparently, and my question is to Mr. Tangen, apparently, Mr. Blinken, Secretary Blinken's initial comments, which referred to obviously Taiwan and Hong Kong and Xinjiang, got Mr. Jiechi to respond. But going by his 16-minute presentation thereafter, it seems that at some level he was prepared for that kind of comments from Secretary Blinken and was prepared to, respond.
Oh, absolutely, Jess. I mean, there were, two real possibilities. I think everyone was a little bit surprised that they started off this way outside the meeting in the public. As you said before, these are generally 2-minute, we have tough talks ahead of us, but we're looking forward to it type of thing. But instead, Blinken, who is a veteran, he is not a novice, he's done hundreds of these, decided to go kind of outside the box and just kind of come at China with this kind of full frontal. I think he was extremely surprised at the vehemence and the length of the rebuttal that he got. Remember, I mean, you could see this kind of slow motion train wreck developing as the U.S. went to the Quad, gathered all sorts of grievances from everyone who was there, then went to South Korea and Japan and did the same, and basically showed up after inviting the Chinese to Anchorage. Generally, this kind of talk would have happened in a neutral country like Singapore or someplace like that, but the Chinese were open to being invited to be there. So it was pretty clear that Blinken wanted to do this, have this kind of big smackdown, but it wasn't apparent. It wasn't clear whether he would try to do it in public. When he did it in public, it seemed like grandstanding, something that was more for the U.S. domestic audience than for actually addressing anything, the relationships between China and the U.S.
Right. Interesting that you mention Quad before I proceed further and pull in Professor Larus. On Australia, it's becoming a test case of sorts in terms of a choice. Australia, obviously, in terms of security, is a very close ally of the United States, one of the states in the Quad, but it also import and exports combined, its biggest trading partner is China. Since November last year, China has been sanctioning imports across various commodities. And Kurt Campbell, who is Mr. Biden's czar for Southeast Asia, stated to the Sydney Morning Herald saying that we are not going to leave Australia alone on the field. Interestingly, former Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop warned against tit for tat with Beijing and against angering China. So let me just wanted to flag this point. We will get back to this, but let me get to Professor Larus here. Professor Larus, as Mr. Tangen has said, and this has also been commented upon by some publications with reference to Secretary Blinken's opening statement being more for the domestic audience, given the Republican pressure on President Biden. Is that something that you would agree with?
The view in Washington is different, certainly, than the view in Beijing. In Washington, certainly the expectations were low for these talks. There was no expectation for a big breakthrough. However, Washington, believes that both countries are very important, influential countries and need to meet and need to communicate. So they met in Alaska, and as you indicated, according to protocol, each side was supposed to give a 2-minute just introductory statement to the press, and then the press would leave. And then the parties would get down to some more substantive talks. But what surprised the U.S. was that the opening salvo by China, which was supposed to be limited to generally, 2 minutes, rather bland, type of comments, turned into a 16 or more minute condemnation of the United States. And we know the accusations that were logged, they've been all over the press. So that didn't go well on the U.S. side. And then Blinken came back pretty much with bare knuckles. And remember, I just said that the media was supposed to leave after 2 minutes. But he said, no, media, you stay. And then he pretty much laid into the Chinese side, and we saw the litany of accusations. And so it did then devolve into this bare knuckle type of situation, which I think neither side was completely prepared for. Yang Jiechi is the CCP's, the Chinese Communist Party's top official for foreign affairs. He is very polished. And he knew that by going in and laying it out, in those comments to the United States, that he would probably get back. And so if you look at the Chinese press, or you look at the Washington press, it's interesting to see how it was played very differently on different sides of the world.
Right. Let me get Leung's view on this. Mr. Leung, now the issue here has basically, and when I say here, not just on this program, but generally, depending on which side of the divide one is, about, whether the first salvo came from China or whether it was Secretary Blinken. Now, we do know that in his opening statement, Secretary Blinken mentioned some of those issues that have become particularly sensitive for China. So would you say that, were you surprised by Yang Jiechi's long response, or do you think that would have been expected after Secretary Blinken's initial remarks?
Well, in fact, both sides' opening statement and responses were to a large extent is for the domestic theater. Because, as pointed out, in the United States, there is a tremendous pressure on the part of the Republicans on this bipartisan consensus to be tough on China. And therefore, the Biden team started off with having to open the remarks from a position of strength, having gone through all these meetings before with other court members, as it were. But this, of course, hit a raw nerve on the Chinese side because the Chinese perceive that as a demonstration of the United States talking on a high horse on a modern China, who's no longer the China under the knuckle of foreign imperialists. So the specter of the century of humiliation was very much alive. So I think there's no wonder that the Chinese team rebutted these kind of accusations rather strongly. But I think that this also hides a clash of national identity, whereas the United States prides itself on being the tower on the hill. In other words, guarding the whole world's liberal order, whereas the Chinese nationalist identity is to grow their country, is to bring better lives to its people. And the American response is perceived to be putting stumbling blocks in China's legitimate trajectory. And of course, there is also the clash of a different sense of national security. For China, the national security involves also national sovereignty. So issues like Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, they are very, very much at the heart of the China's sense of national security. And for the United States to be seen to encroach or criticize what China's been doing is perceived to be another act of aggression, hence what happened.
Right. So the Biden administration seems to have decided that they will indeed cross the red lines, the Chinese red lines. But interestingly, Drew Thompson, who's a former China analyst at the Defense Department, said that he had been surprised by Biden's early willingness to confront Beijing while still getting to grips with the COVID-19 pandemic at home. And let me put out his exact quote. The Biden administration has exceeded my expectations about how they would approach the challenges presented by China while simultaneously tackling critical domestic issues. Equally, Jake Sullivan, who's the national security advisor, after the meeting in Anchorage, said the two sides had held tough discussions after an initial exchange on Thursday. And he said, and I quote from what he said, "We expected to have tough talks on a wide range of issues, and that's exactly what we had." So it seems that, according to him, the U.S. was clear-eyed coming in, and we are clear-eyed going out. Mr. Tangen, given all this, and I also mentioned Australia, so I would want you to say a few words about that also. Given this, we've had these discussions on this program where we discussed the fact that, the incoming Biden administration might be more nuanced about dealing with China. But, and this is, of course, just one meeting, and one can't really ground one's analysis in just, in a snapshot view of one meeting, because we'll have to look at the trajectory. But to the extent of what happened, what is your sense now? Are you recasting your previous, analysis with reference to a more nuanced approach, or do you think that this is going to be, bare knuckle thing?
Well, I don't know if nuance includes listing 24 Hong Kong politicians on your blacklist shortly before you're having a meeting, or delisting 3 Chinese telecoms. I think it's very clear that there was no nuance here, that this was just red meat for the domestic audience. I would disagree with my previous colleague when he said that this was domestically for the Chinese audience. This was, Yang Jiechi was answering to the international audience. He wanted to point out that, Biden keeps saying that he's back, that, the U.S. is back. Well, but for 22,000 votes in 3 states, Trump would still be there, even despite the popular vote, etc. There are a lot of questions about what's happening in the U.S. between what happened at the Capitol, in Texas, the handling of COVID-19, even going back to the financial meltdown. This is not a country that can say, follow us, look what we have done. And that's what Yang Jiechi was doing. So in terms of Australia, this once again goes to this kind of hypocritical world that Biden seems to be creating. He says that China has to be nice to Australia. That's very rich, coming from a country that have imposed unilateral tariffs on China under the Trump administration, which were decried even by the very people who are now continuing them. So, this idea that, it's okay, we'll tell you what to do, but we won't follow it ourselves. And this is true also with Xinjiang and, this situation with Kashmir. No mention of that, although there are daily death tolls that are happening there. And, the nuance is not showing itself also in terms of the way it's handling Russia. Calling another head of state a murderer, just a killer, is just not exactly what you want to do when you know you're going to have to see that person in the future. And whether you like them or not, whether you want to get along with them or not, the idea is that you're a leader and you can get over those things so that you can do what is necessary for your country, not indulge in yourself in name calling. I think that was something that Donald Trump did. So I don't see a lot of nuance going on here. I see Biden, a politician, acting like a politician. He's concerned about the midterms. He's concerned about the next presidential election, and he's doing what he thinks is necessary to shore up his political base rather than taking care of the major issues that are confronting not only the United States, but the world as a whole.
Right. Professor Larus, let me just draw on your, since you are a professor of political science and international relations. So structural realists are very clear about these things. As Professor Mearsheimer says, that's the tragedy of great power politics. But what we see with liberal institutionalism is a strange kind of mix. On the one hand, of liberal ideals or neoliberalism, and realpolitik. So even when you want to say, as President Biden has said, that we are part of the great sort of democracies of the world, and he wants to have a global conference, the fact is that many of the democracies that the US wants to partner with, and I can name one, India, is not just completely illiberal, it's sliding down into authoritarianism. So my point being that what kind of theoretical framework are we looking at in terms of the practitioners' policy approaches here as far as the US is concerned?
U.S. foreign policy has long been a marriage of realism and liberalism. Realism in the sense that without any supranational organization keeping all the nation states in line, that country seeks security. And for the realists, security is through military power. It's diplomacy as well, but mostly military power. And then liberalism is more about keeping the peace through international laws and institutions. So really, since the end of World War I, the United States foreign policy has been a marriage of both. We're in the UN, but also we use the military when we feel that U.S. security and increasingly global security has been threatened. So you end up with a foreign policy where other countries might look and say, that's rather odd. But it is true that international relations makes strange bedfellows. And look at World War II. The United States was allied with the Soviet Union because the big bad wolf were it's Hitler's Nazi socialists. And so the United States, when it's looking for security, and right now, if you want to talk about the Asia Pacific, that does lead us to resurrecting this idea of the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is not an alliance. It's like a jaw coalition, perhaps, forming. And we don't know where this is going to go. But it is made up of U.S. allies and friends in the Pacific that are concerned about China's, not just its economic rise. Look, no country can keep another country down. And the view from Washington is that Washington is not trying to prevent China's economic rise. For goodness sakes, it's already risen, right? It's using its military might to threaten the security of the other, its neighbors, the other nation states in the region. And so hence Japan has always been extremely important to the U.S. security calculus in the Asia Pacific. Australia has always had the United States back and cooperation, sometimes grudgingly, admittedly, sometimes grudgingly.
But let me interject here, Professor Larus. Let's just, I'll quickly take this back to Ms. Tangen. But Australia, Beijing's smackdown has followed a number of open positions that the Morrison government took in terms of its, statements on South China Sea, its statements on Hong Kong, on Taiwan, on the international inquiry over COVID-19 and the rest. And it seems to me that China is now making Australia a test case of, of course it's a rising power. It's going to have a Monroe Doctrine of its own. So Australia will probably have to make a choice between security and prosperity. So just give me a sense of this, because while the United States can wed these two, and that's a long discussion, I wish we had the time for that, realpolitik and liberalism, the fact is that Australia doesn't have that choice.
Well, it is true Australia relies very heavily on China for its economic prosperity. However, notice that, from the point of view of Washington, Australia asked for an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID. And that was about a year ago. What is so outrageous about that? And what is so outrageous about asking Beijing to respect one country, two systems, which is in ink, right? And so the question then rises, okay, is Australia asking legitimate questions? And from Washington's point of view, yes. But then China turned around and says, well, we're not going to buy so much of your coal. We're not going to buy so much of your wine. So see, the views are very, very different. So where Washington and Australia agree is on preserving
Professor Larus, China is doing exactly, and much less, if you ask me, as a student of political science and history, much less than what the United States has done in the Americas, and far more ruthlessly. So my point was that it's not about the legitimacy of the questions that the Australian government has asked, but more about whether within the framework of realpolitik, Australia has enough heft to punch at that level. But let me pull in Mr. Leung here. Mr. Leung, Mr. Tangen said that he does not particularly agree with you on about the fact that the Chinese top diplomat, Mr. Jaishi, was also focusing on the domestic audience. But give me also your sense of this Sino-Australia tensions.
Well, of course, the primary objective of this discourse is not for the domestic audience. Far from it, but the domestic audience is also important because the rising sense of nationalism and the Chinese people cannot bear any longer to be talked down, on a high horse by an aggressive foreign power. But on the other hand, this is, as my colleague was saying, is for the entire world because China has risen almost from the ashes a couple of decades ago. Modern China is no longer the China of about 30 years ago, or even just after the founding of the People's Republic. It's now the second largest economy. It has done much better on the pandemic. It's lifted billions of people out of poverty. And then, of course, is the popularity of the communist regime, as in terms of support by its people, has ranked by the latest report from the Harvard Kennedy School as the countries with the highest rankings, multiple ranks above even the United States. Now, coming back to Australia, of course, Australia as an American ally But I think that for Australia to point to the Asia Pacific and to the South China Sea and to Hong Kong, for that matter, I think it's really misunderstanding or misjudging China's sense of security. Because the South China Sea is not just territory. The South China Sea is China's conduit of sea lanes of communication, a very important conduit for its lifeblood of foreign trade and raw materials. And of course, it's got to build up its own defenses. As for Hong Kong and Taiwan, these are matters of national sovereignty. Hong Kong has remained to be a very, very different city from the mainland, but yet the past 23 years, Hong Kong has remained very, very free. But because of the recent rise of separatism and the so-called self-determinism, or even open demand for independence, this is really trampling on China's sense of national security. And for foreign powers who do not understand, speaking someone from Hong Kong, to pontificate on what China can do for Hong Kong, it really angers the Chinese team tremendously. And in fact, a lot of Chinese people from this kind of high horse talk on places like Xinjiang or Hong Kong, where I am.
Right. To wrap up, let me circle back to Mr. Tangen. Mr. Tangen, one of the points that Professor Larus was making is that the United States does not want to prevent China's economic growth, but it's China's flexing of military muscle and the kind of security threat that it poses to the states in the region that's of major concern to the United States, which has treaty partners in the region. Would you give me your comments on this before I close the program?
I would disagree. I mean, it's about maintaining hegemony. It's a pure pragmatic, realpolitik type of thing. I mean, this intellectual comments should not be a team sport. It's not whether you're for the U.S. or for China. It's about the reality that we face right now. And this kind of bumbling into a pre-World War I situation where a dominant power is trying to contain a rising power is not a good idea. And the U.S. is not in a position of strength. We can see that from the domestic issues that are there, from the forever wars that are abroad. I find it a little repugnant that people are trying to, quote, defend this as part of a marriage of principles and realism. It isn't. It's just simply wrong, and it's time to reset and get back on the right track.
Right, but with reference to China's military projection of military power in the region, is that something that you would agree with?
I think China has to be very careful about pushing its military. It has a tendency to do tit for tat. I think it would behoove them far more to relax on that level. But that is a domestic concern, a strategic concern that they have to do it. I think right now China is in a position to win the soft power war because of the missteps of the U.S. and the weakness of Europe. I think it's best to do that with charm as opposed to arms.
Right. On that note, thank you so much, Dr. Elizabeth Larus, Mr. Einar Tangen, Mr. Andrew K.P. Leung. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the resignation of a top Indian intellectual because of pressure from a right-wing government and students in Bangladesh protesting the visit to Dhaka by India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. India's right-wing government continues to silence and sideline critics. In the latest episode, one of India's top intellectuals, Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta, has resigned from his position as professor, saying that the board of the university saw him as a political liability. Ashoka University was founded in 2014 as India's answer to the Ivy League. Professor Mehta wrote in his resignation letter, and I quote from that, "My public writing in support of a politics that tries to honor constitutional values of freedom and equal respect for all citizens is perceived to carry risks for the university," unquote. According to an Indian Express story, Ashoka's founders met Dr. Mehta recently and said they could no longer protect him in the, again, this is a quote, current political environment, unquote. Dr. Mehta had already stepped down as Vice Chancellor of Ashoka University in 2019, reportedly because the trustees were worried by his outspoken views, but had remained a political science professor at that university. The university has yet to comment, but matters escalated last Thursday when Mr. Arvind Subramanian, a former chief government economic advisor, resigned from Ashoka in solidarity. And he said that the university can no longer provide a space for academic expression, and freedom is ominously disturbing. And this is what the media reported, citing his letter of resignation. That's Mr. Subramanian's letter of resignation. Meanwhile, students in Bangladesh on both right and left have been protesting against Indian Prime Minister's visit to Bangladesh to discuss what's happening in India and India's image under a right-wing government. I'm joined by Ravi, Srivastava, a political and economic affairs commentator, and Dr. Yaqoob Bangash, a historian of modern South Asia and assistant professor at Information Technology University. Let me begin with Dr. Bangash here. Yaqoob Bangash, you're an academic yourself. We have also faced these pressures in Pakistan, but India used to pride itself on, what it claimed was this kind of intellectual and academic freedom. But over the years, we have seen that that is eroding. So give me your initial thoughts about Dr. Mehta's resignation.
I actually know Dr. Mehta, and I think it's no surprise that he's resigned now. I was actually surprised that it took so long because this has really been long in the making. From the time that the Modi government has come into power, its main aim has been to curtail academic freedom. From day one, it's actually been against academic freedom. And if you look at government universities, what has it done to JNU by imposing its own vice chancellor there? At JNU, things went to such an extreme that it even prevented the history department from even taking any PhD students. So that's the extent to which this regime will go to control things under the universities that are directly under them. They've interfered in Aligarh Muslim University. They have tried to shut down the Nehru Memorial Trust. They have tried to rewrite the history of India. They've inducted RSS members everywhere in every cultural, academic, and scientific organization. So this has been there, since the time Modi came to power, which interestingly enough kind of corresponds to the time that Ashoka was set up.
Let me go to Mr. Srivastava here. Mr. Srivastava, you have been very kind to appear on my program. It's been more than a year and a half. You've made appearances on the program, and every time I have expected that, I'll actually get to speak with you on something positive about India, which obviously there are many positive things. But unfortunately, since the BJP government's arrival on the scene, the level of positivity has dropped and the level of negativity and negative news has increased alarmingly. Now, we have discussed this previously also. But give me your initial thoughts of Dr. Mehta's resignation, as Dr. Bangash is saying, and I know that he knows Dr. Mehta. Bangash says that he's actually surprised that it took so long.
It's a part of a larger agenda, actually. That is the saffron purging of the educational institutions and finish up with the academic freedom of the individuals, the eminent professors, and the people who really think about the country. Pratap Bhanu Mehta was associated with Ashoka for quite some time, and this university was made almost on a parallel with imparting education on the lines of the Howard or Wharton or Ivy League and other top institutions of the world. And you can imagine that it has a fee of 10 times of what St. Stephen's or Miranda House are charging in Delhi. So it's a prestigious institution, but the resignation of Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta is indeed a very shocking thing. It shows that how this government is bent upon capturing the education system of this country. And what Dr. Yaqoob was rightly saying, they have been doing it since they came into power in 2014. It is started with the JNU. JNU is a real thorn for the government, then followed by Jamia Millia, followed by the Aligarh Muslim University. They did it even in Banaras Hindu University. And all these institutions, they are appointing people of RSS background, the right-wingers, and those people are being inducted into it. And it is indeed further shocking that Dr. Arvind Subramaniam, who was the chief economic advisor of the country and a professor with Ashoka, he has also resigned in solidarity with him. Although since you use the word, there is no positivity, I can tell you a little amount of positivity is visible, because Ashoka students, they went on a sit-in and they gave a memorandum to the trustees of the institution, and the trustees have come out with a statement today that they will be doing institutional processes are to be corrected, and they are working now in that direction. So I think there's some amount of bending is visible from the Ranshu, that is the chancellor, and that Malvika Sarkar, who are the prime trustees over there. So they have realized perhaps that something is awfully wrong with the whole system over there, and they have to correct it. But as I told you in the beginning, this is a bigger plot. They are trying to change the national education policy. They are trying to change even the system at the primary level of the institution. And some institutions are encouraged for this, like Ekal Vidyalaya or Saraswati Shishu Mandir, which are imparting a Hindu cultural education to the students. So this is one, and there is one Mr. RSS supporter, Sri Dinanath Batra, who is changing the syllabus, and they are rewriting the history. Rightly said by Dr. Bangash, that they are rewriting the history altogether. So such attempts are being made, which are dangerous.
Right. Dr. Yaqoob Bangash, I'm just trying to understand this. As you know, we have gone through this, and in some ways we are still going through this kind of thing in Pakistan, and we have suffered the consequences of it also. India was accumulating a lot of soft power, marks, shall I say, or points. It would have been perfect for India to have remained on that trajectory. But it's surprising that India has managed to, under this BJP government, erode that image so fast. And as you also mentioned, as Mr. Srivastava is also mentioning, that this project, Hindutva, is becoming a juggernaut of sorts.
I think all of this is kind of pre-planned to a certain extent, and I don't think that they mind this because they really think that India's development and where India has come is not because of the reason of its constitution, if it is not because of the reason of its framework of rights and responsibilities and of its secular nature. They actually think that is something that kept India back and did not actually let itself develop. So they actually want to break the framework, break the mold in which India was set by its founding fathers, and that is why they are very brazenly against Gandhi, Nehru, and all the founding fathers of India, except, of course, they have now revamped Sardar Patel into their grand hero. But they do not realize that the reason India did so well comparative to other countries, and the reason that India was going ahead, is that in a multicultural, multi-religious and multi-ethnic country, the only way to go ahead is to have a broad-based and a secularized government. There's no other way of going through. But now what is happening is that the Hindu middle class that is now coming up, this idea that now Hindu Raj aayega, one of the things that Gandhi used to talk about was Ram Rajya. But Ram Raj was a time of peace. He never actually said that, it was an actual kind of a Hindu age for that matter. For these people, they do want to bring in a Hindu age. And for that Hindu age to appear, everything else has to fall in place. They cannot have any aspect of life that is not controlled. And you very rightly pointed out, Ijaz, that Pakistan has gone through it, is going through it. But here I would say that, one of the good things about Pakistan, at least in this case, is we're very incompetent. So the last time we actually went through it, it only happened in government schools. Private schools were actually exempted. So for about 30 years, private schools were completely fine. But this Hindutva government in India, they know all of this. They are not incompetent. They are actually well planned. So it's for the government schools, it's for the government universities, and it's for all private institutions also, because they want to. It is an ideology. It is, like fascism, it is an ideology that permeates every facet of life. And they want every facet of life to be really defined by that ideology. Until that happens, they will not relent. And of course, they don't know and they don't want to accept, really.
Right. I also have to wrap up, but let me go back to Mr. Srivastava for a very quick comment, Mr. Srivastava. I've got a couple of minutes left. This seems like a pretty bleak picture. And do you think, I know you've been optimistic about the pushback from the secular side, but the manner in which this project is unfolding, it seems to me that it might be too late before things could be turned around.
India's total picture across the world actually is defined by its secularism, which is the bone of the country's constitution and which has been practiced all along. Now, this particular government, right since inception in 2014, they tried to inject slowly this Hindutva, this right-wing ideology, the RSS ideology, all those things in a slow process. Not lucky, I would say, there is a big mass of Hindus who are really misguided by this kind of agenda, and they brought back this government again in 2019, and post that they are aggressively pursuing it. They are trying to change the syllabus.
So I understand, Srivastava. I've also run out of time, but all I can say is that your job is cut out for you, and it's becoming increasingly difficult by the day. But thank you so much. That was Mr. Ravi Srivastava. Thank you, Dr. Yaqoob Bangash also. This is all from In Focus tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.